Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. There's a brief two-verse passage in Proverbs that has tended to confuse everybody that comes across them. While I'm sure that many people have written learned commentaries on the verses, I hope to put forward what I hope will clarify thinking or at least spur discussion. The passage in question reads, "Do not answer fools according to their folly, or you will be a fool yourself. Answer fools according to their folly, or they will be wise in their own eyes." Standard reaction after reading this the first time is, that doesn't even make sense. How can we both answer fools according to their folly and not answer them according to their folly? It's often cited as one of the flagrant contradictions in the Bible, one that's so obvious that nobody could miss it. However, I propose that these are not really contradictory at all, and are somewhat similar to the English phrases, "many hands make light work" and "too many cooks spoil the broth," which, while seeming inconsistent, really express two different ideas. It's true that they cannot both be unilaterally applied to every situation without contradiction, but everybody's been in situations where they could clearly tell that one aphorism was more appropriate than the other. This is what I think is going on here. I think the more obvious part of the passage is, "Answer fools according to their folly, or they will be wise in their own eyes." I think that most people are pretty clear that foolish people, if not corrected or debunked, will continue on as if they were right the whole time. Indeed, as we see more and more, even people who are faced with overwhelming evidence in contradiction of their beliefs tend to hold to those beliefs all the more, rather than abandon them. At the very least, answering fools according to their folly will make sure they are not wise in anyone else's eyes. However, what does it mean to not answer fools according to their folly? At first glance, there doesn't seem to be any other explanation than one that will contradict the second bit of advice. And yet I want to put forward something that I've learned in the last year or so that might help. The more I study, and the more I contemplate the gospel, the more I realize that some of the predominant ways of thinking, frame of knowledge, is very much destructive to really understanding the gospel. And what's interesting, destructive to really understanding some of the major advances of sciences in the last century. Every so often I find myself engaging in dialogue with someone who is not only formed in some way by these ways of thinking, as we all are to one degree or another, but passionately committed to it, effectively binding themselves and all their hopes quite fully to it. What happens is that in order to have a conversation with them, it's effectively demanded that I embrace a whole way of thinking that I have found to be deeply problematic. To challenge or critique such a way of thinking, however, is seen as unacceptable at best, or irrational at worst. This is where I think Proverbs helps. Every time I accept fundamentally faulty premises in a discussion, whether by accident or by hoping that somehow I will be able to show how faulty they are by doing so, I find myself utterly trapped in them. Often people will state a question in a way that they have heard it stated in the past and ask me to answer their question precisely as they have stated it. The reason, of course, is because they find that particular question of intense interest. Usually they want me to choose sides, either so they can try to presume the rest of my convictions from one hotly contested one, or so they can decide if I'm a heretic or not. The problem with this is that many people do not realize that many of the debates that rage within the church and within philosophical circles are fundamentally flawed from the start. The way we tend to force people into two opinions, two options that are posed as the only alternatives also forces, at the same time, people into a particular way of viewing the problem. Even the way of phrasing the problem traps us into a particular way of viewing the problem. In my experience, many of the questions that burn in the minds of people I've met are not really problems in the true sense at all. That is, they do not actually arise from the gospel. Instead, I'm convinced that they arise from forcing the gospel into a framework that is alien to it. To give an example, many people work within a framework of belief that compels them to think of the universe as a closed, mechanistic system of cause and effect. This often manifests itself theologically as a high doctrine of predestination or predeterminism, though many people who affirm what they call free will often have this view of the universe. To such people, to affirm anything that is not utterly predetermined is to say that God leaves some things, if not all things, to chance. And usually the latter because it's hard to reconcile God's predetermining hand with even partial chance in the universe. But this whole way of thinking insists that the only alternative to such a deterministic view is to affirm that everything is random. Since neither Christian theology nor modern science will allow the universe to be random, determinism seems to be the only choice remaining. But is this so? The Judeo-Christian tradition has always affirmed that God created the universe out of nothing, as something that is distinct from God but utterly dependent on Him for its order. This means that nothing in the universe is necessary because it might have been different than it is. Indeed, it might not have been at all. God was under no compulsion to create and could have acted quite differently. This means any kind of order in the universe must be thought of as non-necessary and contingent. However, to such a framework of thought, non-necessary or contingent order is a contradiction in terms, because anything that is not necessary must be left to chance. What is interesting is that while science, since the Renaissance, has often affirmed such a view of the universe, post-Einsteinian thought has completely rejected it. In fact, the so-called Big Bang Theory affirms that the whole universe as it came into being, or as it is, came into being, that it was not always as it is now, that it is possible it might never have come to be, and that it will not ever come to be again. The universe, though vast, is finite, but unbounded and ever-expanding. It is not self-explaining, so not necessary, but also characterized throughout with comprehensive order. It is true that the cosmological position that can be reached by natural science is not the same thing as the Christian doctrine of creation out of nothing, but it is much more congenial to such a Christian understanding than ever before. The point is that both Christian theology and natural science deny that the universe is a closed system of cause and effect. Indeed, to speak of necessity is to clamp an artificial idea on the dynamic character of nature. Even to use terms like non-necessary or uncertainty implies a framework of thought that is fundamentally characterized by necessity and certainty. Rather, we must think of open systems where they are influenced and impacted by forces outside of themselves, though not in a deterministic way, which implies that a system is and must be closed. The point is that the moment I accept a question or way of thinking that uses terms like necessity or cause and effect, in the more rigid sense of that phrase, or even uncertainty, I have already imported a damaging way of thinking into the discussion. In order to do justice to reality, I must reject this whole way of thinking. To try to speak of reality within a framework alien to reality is to answer a fool according to his folly in such a way that I am made a fool myself. Because once I have allowed myself to get sucked into such a frame of thought, it's impossible to get out again. Those are some thoughts. I hope that spurs thought and perhaps discussion.